right, we got some good music going on here. I thought we were gonna have a dance segment first. You want to give them 30 seconds of?
I'm ready.
Well, we are here to talk about the media. Dun dun dun. You know, the big topic. Lots of people are talking about it, and I wanted to ask you two visionary leaders in the media space one question to start this, and that is, without mentioning the United States president, what has been the biggest change in media, in the space, in what you do over the past year? And we'll start with you, Joe.
Yeah, well, thanks for hosting, thanks for being here. You know, I've worked every presidential election since 2004, and I took a leave of absence from my group to do the Marco Rubio presidential campaign, not the president. And the biggest thing that struck me from 2012 to 2016 in the United States was the complete collapse of the news cycle. It used to be very predictable. You had the first 15 minutes of the Today Show was the most important thing back in 2004. You had certain journalists you went to and you talked to, and if you pitched a story and got it planted, it would go viral. But now in 2016, when I was working the campaign, everything had collapsed. You had a story that would last 15 minutes. You had a story that would last 5 days. It was utterly unpredictable in the way of what was happening. And part of that was, I think, we had a proliferation of news sources, new content platforms to push out material to, new voices in the debate, much more partisan than it used to be. So the biggest thing that I saw in 2016 was there's no predictability to the news media anymore.
All right, Jay?
Yeah, I think that there are two huge issues that happened over the last couple of years. One is that television is dissolving. And ESPN, for example, lost 12 million subscribers in the last 12 months. And it's only because they're the largest of the cable operators. And so CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all of them are losing subscriber year in, year out. Television has lost 40% of its audience under the age of 25 within the last 6 years. They've lost 30% of their audience under the age of 35 in the last 6 years. The second huge trend is the different cultures that are now created. And we've never had a bigger cultural change in American history. And it's not based on race or gender or any of the things that we're used to. It's based on age. Television is for older people. And people who grew up on television get their news in a broad way, and they don't dive into the issues. They're not as well educated. Millennials who get their news from the internet are far better educated, dive into the specific policy issues, and then have a much better BS meter. So politicians are used to the television age because they're all old. So they go on television and they do their standard talking points, and millennials hate it. It's not authentic. They know what the reality is. And the older generation that keeps relying on Morning Joe is dumbfounded. They're like, why can't we trick them anymore? And I think that is an enormous divide, which is very important to the media and politics.
But one thing where those demographic groups seem to come together is today the difference between politics and media doesn't seem to be an important difference at all in lots of places. Both of you operate in the media and politics space, and traditionally people in media would tell you cannot be political, or people in politics would tell you to beware of going into strictly media spaces. So what do you think the impetus behind that synthesis, behind merging has been, and do you think we're seeing a trend? What are the trends in that space?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of different things. One, the media, the news organizations have lost that public utility role. You know, they're no longer a public good of here's the basic information you need today. They're more active voices now in the debate. They're building their own brands of credibility and whatnot. And I think that's where, it's about politics, and we have more partisan voices in the media. But I think it's still important to remember the difference between the two when it comes to places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, is the media still has one thing that a lot of voices don't have, which is credibility. Credibility to ask the next question, credibility to get a source to talk. And I think that credibility is really important. And I think we're seeing in the United States a lot of papers kind of go back to basics. You know, with the Washington Post and New York Times, it's now, instead of, you know, being very active, being that public utility, it's more about doing traditional reporting and doing news stories that have like 12, 24, 36 different sources talking about the administration, talking about what's happening on Capitol Hill. And I think that's why we're actually seeing the Washington Post, the New York Times do well. So instead of, you know, I think they are starting to differentiate themselves from all of what's out there by going back to basics almost.
New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic too, also.
The Atlantic, yeah.
So I think that there are three different kinds of journalism now. And unfortunately, I think for a long time in America, the branch that is the worst was dominating. The worst branch of journalism is neutral journalism. So if you applied it to sports, it would be preposterous. Manchester United played Real Madrid, to use a European example, and in objective journalism says one side won 2-1. The other, in neutral journalism, you would say Real Madrid says they won, Manchester United says they won, I guess we'll never know. And that is preposterous. And unfortunately, for so long, especially on television, they would say Democrats say this, Republicans say that. I don't know who's right. Well, that's your job. You're supposed to figure out who's right and who's wrong. Objective journalism, which I think Joe was alluding to now, is aggressive and finds out and gets their sources and finds out what is true and what is not true. Then the third branch is perspective journalism, and that's what I do. So I think that our audience, which is much younger, 70% of our audience is 18 to 34 years old, because we're online and we speak to them, demands that we care, and reward shows that care. So if I were to say, I'm neutral, I don't really care what happens in the news, they wouldn't watch me. They watch us, and they picked us out of the thousands of shows online because we do care, we're activists, and we go out there and try to make change in the world, and there's nothing wrong with that.
I think when it comes to politics, one of the hardest things for reporters and publications to realize is they no longer play that traditional gatekeeper role from the 1970s, 1980s. It used to be, if you wanted to be a national leader, if you wanted to run for president, you had to talk to the leading reporters at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and if you did not click with them, that was a problem for your candidacy. It's no longer true. Like, I think it's more important that you go out and talk to as many different news sources as possible to produce more content than ever before. Because I think with the collapse of the news cycle, with so many different voices out there, it's not about just talking to one person. It's about talking to so many people that you create more and more data points that your narrative breaks through. So I think it's hard for the traditional media, the neutral media, to realize they no longer play that vetting role that they used to play from the 1980s.
Well, it seems like the trends you all are talking about are all in reaction to something, and the something I think that's in the middle of this all is, I don't even want to say fake news because that's such a cliche term and it doesn't quite capture everything, but there's a concerted and oftentimes just, there's an effort to create the perception that you can't know the objective truth. There are people, there are outlets that go and run things that aren't even just not true. They question the idea of whether truth can exist. And so how do we combat that? And how do we combat the public perspective of the media as an estate that no longer has an effect on their lives?
Well, so it starts with being honest with the audience. And part of the problem with the mainstream media is that I don't believe that they are honest about their perspective, and they lose credibility, and then it allows, in my opinion, the far right wing to say, well, none of it matters, none of it is true. So what do I mean by that? I think that their perspective and their bias is not a liberal bias or a conservative bias, it's an establishment bias. Almost everyone on television believes in their heart of hearts that the status quo is good, and that we must maintain order, we must maintain the status quo. I think that and Joe and I probably will agree on this even though we're on opposite ends of the political spectrum, I would guess that 148 out of 150 television anchors on TV voted for Hillary Clinton. And to them, Trump was an anathema, but so was Bernie Sanders. They don't want change. And a lot of them on television are millionaires, and they work for multi-billion-dollar corporations. So it is not surprising that they are in favor of the status quo. So when they don't recognize that and they pretend to be objective while poo-pooing any kind of change on the left or right, they lose credibility. When I opened for Bernie Sanders in a lot of the rallies in California, and the biggest applause line I would get was when I went after the mainstream media, because the left doesn't believe them and the right doesn't believe them. So then that opens up, unfortunately, a space where people can come in and go, since the people on TV are lying to you, let me tell you this, and even if it's outrageous and completely false, it gets people to start thinking maybe that's true. And so I think that's a huge part of the problem.
I'll put a little bit of a different spin on it. Same point, but I think if you look at the job of a reporter today, a reporter has to produce more content than ever before. They have to tweet, they have to write for the online publication, they have to write for the print edition the next day, they have to go on TV, they have to go on online shows, they have to do a podcast. So they have to say more things than ever before. And then times that by how many journalists that we have. The real danger in this fragmented news environment that we're dealing with is when all those sources of content agree on something and they create a bubble as to what is true. 3 weeks out from the election, after the Washington Post popped the audio tape on Donald Trump, I said his name, Donald Trump.
You're off the stage.
I'm off the stage. I'm fired. No. Everyone agreed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. They all said it to each other. And what they lost perspective of is what was happening out there in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. If I had told a reporter 2 weeks out, when was the last time Hillary Clinton was in Wisconsin, was in Michigan, as a point in favor of why she might not win, I would have been yelled at, I would have been screamed at, and told that's not fundamentally true. But that was true. So I think the danger, whether you're a company, a trade association, a political candidate, in this fragmented environment, when everyone agrees, it could be actually fundamentally dangerous.
You talk about this bubble in this fragmented environment, and we are at a tech conference. So I think it's important that we talk about social media, the role of these places that now consider themselves not only social media, but media, content creators. And they haven't gotten a really great name over the past couple of weeks with their moves respective to media. So what's the role now of Facebook, of Twitter, of these social media platforms that are becoming content creators themselves in shaping the media landscape? And how can regular people push for them to make reforms to shape their platforms in a way that serves them?
So it's a very tough issue because you've got freedom of speech in America, and so some parts of it are a little bit easier than others. So the Russians were buying ads on a lot of the social media, and that's against the law in America. You can't have foreign countries buying ads to affect our elections. So that should be more straightforward. They've got to make sure that that never happens. And it doesn't matter if it's Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, it doesn't matter. No country, foreign country should be allowed to buy ads that affect our elections. It's illegal. Once you get beyond that, it gets very difficult because, look, there's a great splintering that's happening now. And so I love that television no longer has a monopoly on the news. And I think that's a great thing. And it allows for all these different voices to come forward. And I think that they will eventually coalesce too. And when you get to the coalescing, what you're going to need more than anything else is credibility and the trust of your audience. Because you could do fake news for an election cycle. You might be able to do it for a week. You might be able to do it for a month. But if you keep lying, it's not going to work. And so credible actors on the left, right, and even in the middle are going to win the day as media goes forward on social media. But we can't put the genie back in a bottle. And I sense this great rage from people on television, like, if we could only control social media. And right now they will push a lot of their congressmen, which they have a symbiotic relationship, TV does, with politicians, because a lot of the politicians take their money that they get from their donors and put it into TV ads. So TV wants the status quo, politicians want the status quo, and they are probably going to unite and fight against social media, because social media is destroying the status quo. So I would caution all of you, if you're in the tech world, don't buy into the hype. It's important to fight against actual fake news and foreign interference, but at the same time, don't let them kill the thing that is bringing us democratization of media, which is social media platforms.
So I would make 2 points. One, we work with a couple of these different companies, the third-party platforms on content. And I think what's happening is we're seeing a mind shift on behalf of Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, that usually from their perspective, what was happening in Washington, D.C., what was happening in London, what was happening in Lisbon, was totally separate from them. They were just the platform for content. Now it is completely on their radar what is happening in the national debate, what is happening in international affairs, what is happening from a DC perspective, and putting that on their radar so that their mindset changes so that they can more actively judge their content on their platforms. I don't think we saw that 5 years ago, and I think they're finally awakening to that fact. The second thing, and we work with a host of political clients, I think what we're going to see in 2020, 2024 is more politicians use these platforms to almost run news-like programs, to almost talk directly to their supporters and bypass the media. Use Facebook Live to do, I think, what the Trump guys did at the very end of doing a live TV online program. We all joked about it, but I'm sure that they have data or whatnot back up that might have been a valuable thing for them to do. They'll put more emphasis on using Twitter, more emphasis on using Facebook as a way of directly communicating to their supporters, but also bypassing the media, bypassing the filter. And I think there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons to that, but I think it's something we're going to see in 2020, 2024.
And just one more thing on that. There's a sea change coming, and I don't think they quite see it yet. So you also not only can do your own Facebook or YouTube Live, but you can go on like-minded shows. So Bernie Sanders, when he came on our program in the middle of the primary run, got 6 million views. So that is way more than he ever got on CNN or MSNBC. And I think that once people realize that, and hey, these are my voters. Right before elections, if Democrats aren't going all over progressive online outlets and Republicans doing likewise, they're nuts.
All right, so we have just a very short time left, and I want to ask you both in 10 seconds to get your crystal ball out and tell me what's one thing you think is going to affect the media and political landscape the most in the next 10 years. Jink?
Online media. Television is going to become less and less relevant, and the more you speak to your actual base and your audience and your voters, the more likely you will be to win.
Joe?
So I'll switch it up. It's not just online media. It's all of the partisan sources on your side, ideological sources on your side, just checking the box on every one of them to make sure you create that echo chamber around your candidacy and your company.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your insights, and thank you all for coming. Give the gentleman a round of applause.